Hello. Hi, Denver. Well, thanks for having me. So in 1988, I moved to Denver, not long after finishing culinary school in Washington, D.C. It was a very different city then. There was no Pepsi Center or Coors Field. Elitch's was just right around here back then. And the most recognizable structure downtown was does anyone remember the hyperbolic paraboloid designed by I.M. Pei? It was located on the south side of the 16th Street Mall, and it looked like the big old folded sheet of origami. The north side of the mall ended at Market Street, and beyond it lay the railroad tracks and the no man's land of the Central Platte Valley. When I look at Union Station today with all the building behind it, I just can't believe it. I feel like one of the robots in Westworld just going, this means nothing to me. Anyhow, when I moved to Denver, I looked for the kinds of jobs in restaurants, the kinds of restaurants that I'd want to put on my resume. On the very high end, there were some genteel mausoleums. The Quorum and the Normandy come to mind, and the still grand Palace Arms was beginning to teeter towards obsolescence. There were some exciting, buzzy restaurants, notably Zenith, which was Kevin Taylor's inaugural effort, and Strings from Chef Noel Cunningham, famous for its signature pasta with asparagus, cream, and caviar. None of these seemed quite right for a pretentious little cooking school grad armed with a notebook of recipes written in French. So I set my sights on the three restaurants generally considered the best in the city, the kinds of places where people with an interest in contemporary chef-driven food would choose to spend a lot of money. Cliff Young's on 17th Avenue wasn't hiring. The Rattlesnake Club, set in a soaring two-story space in the Tivoli, was. I got a job there making pheasant confit pizzas and salads of mesclun greens, which were air-freighted daily from California. And honestly, we got in boxes of mesclun greens. No one actually mixed it back then, so we'd get a box of Lola Rosa and a box of Red Oak and a box of Mosh, and it was up to me to mix it all together. Alas, the post-dynasty fallout from the oil and gas boom, as well as the savings and loan crisis, had decimated Denver's economy as well as this restaurant's business. After a few months, I could no longer afford to work there, so I took a job at the other best restaurant, Cafe Giovanni on Market Street, which was less cutting edge but far easier for patrons to love. I was working at Cafe Giovanni when Patricia Calhoun, the editor of Westward, called me to say she had fished my application out of a pile and invited me to become the paper's new restaurant critic. I took to print media like a dog to the back of a pickup truck, excited by everything I saw in a kind of slobbery way. I love being a restaurant critic, first at Westward, then at the Denver Post, and eventually at the paper where I spent most of my career, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I bring up all this old history not solely for the purpose of clearing lint from my navel, but to make a point. Back when I was coming up through the ranks, critics were different because the dialogue around dining was so different. In big cities like Denver, there was a generally recognized hierarchy of restaurants that mattered. Critics used this hierarchy as an organizing principle, and we focused hard on the amenities of dining, giving separate star ratings for food, service, and something that we used to call ambiance. Of course, we went to taquerias and Vietnamese pho restaurants, even the occasional food truck, but we generally covered them in personal columns and annual best of issues. The most insightful restaurant critics recognized that great food in a casual setting merited the attention of a full review. I still remember when Bill St. John, then at the Rocky Mountain News, gave a rare A rating to a quick service burrito stand a young cook had opened near Denver University. It was called Chipotle. Yet we kept the conversation pretty tightly focused on dining destinations with table service. If a Chinese restaurant had cloth napkins and waiters in black uniforms, it was worthy of a review. If it was a guy hacking up duck and pork by a carryout window, it was not. During my time, there were 4 print critics in Denver, and we approached our work like consumer advocates. The conversations we led were less about discovering exceptional experiences and a bit more about how well chefs and restaurateurs hit their marks. Now let's fast forward to the early 2000s. I'm sitting at my desk in Atlanta, where I'm now the critic for the city's only daily newspaper. A guy named Terry, who was one of the mole people who ran the paper's fledgling website, had emerged from his windowless office for our weekly babysitting session. He sat by my side and helped me navigate through to something on our site called, quote, Atlanta Restaurant Forum. It really made my head hurt. One long, endless thread filled with indented sub-threads. Terry sat there and made sure I interacted with the regular group of folks who showed up with a variety of topics in mind. Eventually, these people migrated to a private forum called Atlanta Cuisine, which had a better interface. They talked about my reviews often enough that I felt compelled to drop in from time to time. A few of them went on to start blogs, and I remember writing a really stupid article that basically said, golly, Sarge, there are these nutty things now called food blogs. And look, people are taking pictures of everything they eat, which is like totally bonkers, which is really basically what I wrote back then. Unfortunately, that brought Terry out of his hidey hole again, and he insisted that I start a food blog too. One weekly review wasn't enough to keep a blog going, so I was supplementing it with posts about banh mi sandwiches, fried okra, and English candy bars. I uploaded more than a few blurry pictures of cheeseburgers. I can't remember exactly when Yelp became the main hub for restaurant information or when people started referring to the meandering comments on that site as quote-unquote reviews. Or I can't remember when my published opinion of a restaurant became one among many rather than one among a select few. As easy as it was, and frankly still is, to sneer at Yelp and its army of reviewers prattling on about various things melting in their mouths, it did do a beautiful thing. It took the Church of Criticism away from its high priests and made it ecumenical. It opened up the notion of what was reviewable to include, say, a guy who sold barbecue from the back of his pickup truck once a week in a suburb of Atlanta, or a modernist chef pop-up, or a Korean taco food truck, or a visit to a dozen restaurants serving pho to find the best. And those are all reviews that I wrote. The focus of reviewing shifted, subtly but inexorably, from consumer advocacy to documenting experience. Critics stopped carping so much about unfilled water glasses. Instead, they began fanning obsessions for double-stack burgers, Neapolitan pizza, and craft cocktails. If a new branch of a high-end steakhouse opened in a prominent downtown location, we'd feel less obliged to weigh in. But if a steakhouse began serving ridiculously expensive A5 Miyazaki beef from Japan, of course we felt very obligated to relate the sensation of eating this bovine gold. We started traveling farther and farther afield to look for experience. Today, magazines like GQ, Esquire, and Bon Appetit, as well as online publications like Eater and Bloomberg News, send critics around the country to look for the restaurants that are breaking through the old order in the most exciting and delicious ways. I think in some ways it is a good development since we all travel and look for gustatory thrills on the road. Then again, I worry that this constant focus on destination-worthy food sucks the oxygen away from the local critics who still offer the best advice among the pretty good options. I'll spend $160 on a steak if someone else is footing the bill, frankly, but I'd like to know where to cough up $40 when I'm traveling. As chairman of the James Beard Awards Journalism Committee, I've noticed an interesting development. In the few years since we introduced a Dining and Travel Award, the entries for this category have far outstripped the number of entries for classic restaurant criticism. So anyhow, how does this affect the good work you all do here in Denver? Well, you're going to have a lot more writers dropping in to sample the 3 hottest new restaurants, as well as a couple of classic places for green chili and game. And you'll see more of those specious stories with headlines shouting, finally Denver, or Denver is having a food moment, or great food in Denver, you better believe it. Well, don't believe it. Denver has always had great food, and honestly, pretty good food and pretty awful food, as everywhere has. But it's the great food that I helped prepare as a line cook here and then sampled as a reviewer that I'll never forget. Thank you very much.